The afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees in the family's backyard, casting dappled shadows across the carefully maintained lawn. It was a perfect Saturday in Portland, Oregon, the kind of day that reminded residents why they loved the Pacific Northwest. The temperature hovered around 72 degrees, warm enough to shed jackets, but cool enough that nobody was complaining about the heat. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming jasmine from the neighbor's garden. 3-year-old was dressed in his favorite dinosaur t-shirt, the one with the faded purple T-Rex that had survived several months of toddler abuse. His sandy hair, inherited from his mother's side of the family, was slightly disheveled from an afternoon of outdoor play. His mother, Sarah, had left him unsupervised for only 5 minutes, the same 5 minutes she had been doing for weeks without incident. She was inside the house, preparing juice boxes and apple slices at the kitchen counter, visible through the sliding glass door that opened onto their backyard oasis. Had been chasing butterflies for the past 10 minutes, his little legs pumping as fast as they could carry him across the grass. He was laughing, that uninhibited belly laugh that only young children possess, the kind that makes grandparents' hearts melt and reminds parents why they endure the sleepless nights and endless cleanup. He ran in circles, his arms spread wide like airplane wings, pretending to fly. Every few seconds he'd pause, point at a butterfly and call out, "Mama, Mama." Pretty butterfly, even though his mother couldn't hear him from inside the house. The neighborhood was typical suburban tranquility. Oak-lined streets, well-maintained fences, children's toys scattered across yards, the occasional basketball hoop. It was the kind of place where people felt safe, where children played outside unsupervised, where neighbors knew each other's names and occasionally borrowed eggs or sugar. The family had moved here 18 months ago, specifically choosing this neighborhood for its reputation as a family-friendly, low-crime area. David and Sarah had saved for years to make the down payment on their modest 3-bedroom home. This backyard had been one of the deciding factors: the mature trees, the spacious lawn, the sense of security. That sense of security was about to shatter completely. At exactly 2:47 p.m., 3 houses down the street at 4521 Maple Avenue, Portland police officers were executing a search warrant related to an ongoing narcotics investigation. The operation had been planned for weeks. Intelligence suggested that the residence contained a significant quantity of methamphetamine and possibly other controlled substances. Officers in tactical gear surrounded the property. The operation was meant to be quick and controlled. Officer James, a 12-year veteran of the Portland Police Department, was paired with Duke, a purebred German Shepherd who weighed 95 pounds of muscle and training. Duke was not just any police dog. He had been bred specifically for law enforcement work, purchased from a specialized breeding facility in Germany at a cost of $30,000. His lineage included champions of national police dog competitions. Duke had completed 6 months of intensive narcotics detection training and another 2 months of bite work training. He had apprehended 17 suspects over his 5-year career as a police dog. His bite force exceeded 300 pounds per square inch. He was, in every measurable way, a weapon of the state, trained, controlled, and dangerous. Officer held Duke's leash firmly in his left hand, a sturdy leather lead rated for dogs up to 150 pounds. Duke wore a protective vest marked Police K9 in reflective letters. The dog was in what trainers call work mode focused, alert, with ears perked forward and muscles coiled like springs. Officer was speaking into his radio headset. K9 unit approaching rear entrance. Duke is ready to deploy. The warrant service proceeded as planned for approximately 6 minutes. Officers breached the front door. Duke was brought in to clear the premises and search for controlled substances. The operation was swift and efficient. 3 suspects were taken into custody. Approximately $14,000 in cash was seized, along with 2.5 kilograms of methamphetamine and various drug paraphernalia. It was a successful bust by every measure. But then something went wrong. As officers were securing suspects and photographing evidence, one of the detainees, a man named Dalton, 34 years old, suddenly bolted from where officers had secured him in the living room. He was running toward the back of the house, toward the sliding glass door. Officer, focused on maintaining control of Duke in the crowded interior of the residence, didn't see the man coming. Dalton barreled straight into Officer, the impact sending both the officer and the dog stumbling backward. In that moment of chaos, the leather leash, which had been carefully maintained, but was nonetheless a single piece of equipment relied upon to control 95 pounds of trained aggression, slipped from Officer's hand. Duke, suddenly free and flooded with adrenaline from the warrant service, bolted. The German Shepherd crashed through the sliding glass door into the backyard, the impact shattering the pane into 1,000 glittering pieces. Officer shouted urgently into his radio, "Dog is loose. K9 is loose on Maple. Direction unknown." Duke, running on pure instinct and the overwhelming flood of stress hormones that warrant services produced, crashed through the first fence he encountered, a simple wooden privacy fence that separated the property at 4521 Maple from the neighboring property. He didn't stop. He kept running, driven forward by nothing except the need to escape the chaos, to run, to move, to process the adrenaline. He burst through a gap in another fence, the one separating the neighboring property from the family's backyard at 4523 Maple Avenue. That's when he saw. Back inside the family home, Sarah was humming softly to herself, placing apple slices on a plastic plate decorated with cartoon characters. She heard a sound that would forever change the trajectory of her life, a deep, aggressive bark, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. She spun around, her hands freezing mid-motion. Through the kitchen window, she could see movement near the fence. Her heart, which had been beating normally just seconds before, suddenly accelerated to a gallop. Then she heard the crash of another fence section collapsing. And then she saw him. A massive German Shepherd, his tongue lolling, his eyes wild, his muscles bunched and powerful, burst into her backyard like a four-legged missile. His tactical vest gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. His massive paws thundered across the grass. His bark was not a warning. It was the sound of a powerful animal in high alert mode, flooding with stress chemicals, operating on pure instinct. And standing alone in the middle of the yard, chasing butterflies, completely unaware of what was bearing down on him at maximum velocity, was 3-year-old. Sarah screamed. Her scream was primal, instinctive, the sound a mother makes when she perceives an immediate threat to her child. The juice boxes fell from her hands. The apple slices scattered across the counter. She ran for the sliding glass door, but she was 20 feet away from her son. The German Shepherd was closing the distance at 30 miles per hour. Turned at the sound of his mother's scream, his curious toddler mind not yet understanding danger, not yet comprehending fear. Officer burst through the fence seconds later, his tactical vest heavy on his shoulders, his face twisted in horror, screaming commands that his dog couldn't hear over his own adrenaline. In that frozen moment, that split second before impact, time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously. Sarah was running but moving in slow motion. Officer was shouting but his voice sounded distant. The German Shepherd was closing the distance to 50 feet, 30 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet. The neighborhood held its breath. Everything that happened next would be discussed, analyzed, shared, and reshared millions of times across the entire world. Sarah's body moved through space, but her mind was operating at a completely different speed, a speed that seemed impossibly slow and impossibly fast simultaneously. The distance between her and her son suddenly felt like an ocean. 10 feet. That's all that separated her from 10 feet and a sliding glass door. She could cover that distance in approximately 2 seconds if she ran at full speed. The German Shepherd could cover it in less than 1 second. Her hand reached for the sliding glass door handle, her fingers wrapped around the cool aluminum. She pulled, and the door began to slide open with a soft, almost mocking whisper. Inside her chest, her heart felt like it was going to explode. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, almost hyperventilation. She could taste copper in her mouth, fear manifesting as a physical sensation. The choice crystallized in her mind with perfect, terrible clarity. Option 1. Run to and try to grab him, pull him away from the approaching dog. This was the instinct screaming through every cell in her body, the primal maternal urge that had kept her child alive for 3 years, that woke her at 3 a.m. when he had fevers, that made her check on him obsessively even when he was sleeping safely in his crib. But running toward him, screaming his name, making sudden movements, would that trigger the dog? Would predatory instinct kick in? She had read somewhere, or maybe seen it on a television show, that sudden movements could trigger a chase response in dogs, could make them bite, could turn a dangerous situation into a fatal one. Option 2, freeze, stay where she was, make herself as uninteresting as possible. Maybe the dog wasn't interested in. Maybe it would run right past him. Maybe Officer was right behind the dog and would catch him. Maybe. Sarah's feet were already moving, but they were moving slowly, cautiously, as if her body was divided against itself. She had taken exactly 1 step forward when she stopped. Every parenting instinct she possessed screamed at her to run to her son, to scoop him up, to protect him. But every rational thought, every news article she'd ever read about dog attacks, every nature documentary she'd ever seen about wild animals, every horror story that circulated on neighborhood Facebook groups made her hesitate. She was frozen. This was the impossible choice. The choice that no parent should ever have to make. The choice between action and inaction, between maternal instinct and rational analysis, between the impulse to protect and the fear that her protection might make things worse. Unaware of any of this, simply stood there in his dinosaur shirt, watching the approaching dog with the unself-conscious curiosity of childhood. He had no concept of danger. He had no fear. He had no understanding that the massive animal bearing down on him was trained to bite and apprehend suspects. A dog was a dog, a fascinating creature, potentially a new friend, something interesting to investigate. "Duke, stop!" Officer James' voice cut through the afternoon air like a knife. He was running hard, his tactical vest bouncing with each stride, his face twisted in pure horror and desperation. His boots pounded against the grass. His lungs were screaming. In 12 years of police work and 5 years of working with Duke, he had never lost control of his dog. Never. He prided himself on being a professional, on maintaining control, on being the best handler in the department. And now his dog was loose, charging toward a child, completely ignoring his commands. "Duke, no, stop." The dog wasn't responding. Duke's ears were back, his eyes forward, his entire body focused on the target ahead. Whatever was happening in the canine mind, whether it was adrenaline from the warrant service, whether it was prey drive, whether it was simple curiosity, Duke was not hearing Officer's commands. Officer was approximately 30 feet behind his dog, and that distance felt like a mile. He was running as hard as his body could run, but he knew, with the sick certainty of someone watching events unfold in real time, that he wouldn't reach Duke in time. The mathematics were simple and devastating. Duke would reach in less than 3 seconds. Officer needed at least 5 seconds. All around the neighborhood, people were noticing something was wrong. Mrs. Helen, a 73-year-old widow who lived 2 doors down, was watering her front garden when she heard the first scream. She turned toward the sound and saw the police dog. She recognized it from the regular patrols, bolting through the neighborhood. She saw Sarah standing frozen in her backyard. She saw Officer running. Her brain made the connection. Dog chase. She reached for her phone. Martinez, who worked from home as a software engineer, was on a video call with colleagues in California when he heard the commotion outside his window. He glanced out and immediately ended the call. "I'm sorry, there's an emergency," he said, minimizing the video window. He could see Sarah in her backyard. He could see the massive dog. His stomach lurched with understanding. He opened his phone to call 911 but then hesitated. Wasn't the police already involved? He could see that. He started recording instead, his hands shaking. In the family's backyard, time seemed to move in an entirely subjective way. To Officer, it was a terrible, endless slow motion, each stride taking an eternity, each footfall echoing with his own helplessness. To Sarah, it was both slow and fast, the moment stretching out with crystalline detail while simultaneously feeling like it was happening at impossible speed. To the neighbors watching, it was a frozen tableau, a snapshot of fear and danger and uncertainty. Still oblivious to any danger, was actually moving toward the dog. His curiosity was overriding any sense of self-preservation. He had seen dogs before, the Johnson's retriever, the Williams corgi. This was a bigger dog, sure, but it was still a dog, and dogs were interesting. Took a step forward, his tiny feet moving through the grass. Sarah's voice cracked as she called out, "Stay there, stay right there." But couldn't hear the fear in his mother's voice. He only heard, and he heard his mother's voice, and both of those were familiar and therefore safe. His 3-year-old brain didn't process the tone. It only registered the sound. Officer's legs burned as he pushed harder, faster. "Marcus, don't move," he shouted, though he didn't know if the child could hear him or understand him. He was yelling at the situation, at the universe, at his own failure to maintain control. Duke was 10 feet away from now. Then 5 feet. Then 3 feet. Sarah's hand was covering her mouth. She was making a sound, a small, strangled sound, that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sob. It was the sound of a mother watching her worst nightmare unfold in real time, completely powerless to stop it. Officer's legs were giving everything they had. His lungs were on fire. His voice was hoarse from shouting commands that weren't being obeyed. Was tilting his head, his dinosaur shirt catching the afternoon sunlight, his innocent face curious and open and absolutely defenseless. And the German Shepherd was closing in. The entire neighborhood held its breath. Everything that happened in the next 3 seconds would change the trajectory of every life involved. Duke's massive paws hit the grass approximately 2 feet from. The German Shepherd's body, which had been moving at full charge velocity, suddenly went through a transformation that seemed physically impossible, as if time itself had rewound for just this one animal. It happened in less than half a second, but to everyone watching, it felt like slow motion. The dog's body language shifted entirely. His forward momentum didn't stop instantly. That would have been physically impossible. But it changed direction. Instead of continuing forward, instead of leaping or lunging or exhibiting any of the predatory behaviors that police dog training was designed to produce, Duke's front legs dropped. His front knees bent. His massive chest lowered toward the ground. His rear end stayed high. It was the classic play bow, the ancient canine gesture that means "I want to be friends" or "let's play" or "I'm not a threat." It's something puppies do. It's something dogs do with other dogs they trust. It's something dogs do with humans they love. It is absolutely not something a 95-pound German Shepherd trained in narcotics detection and suspect apprehension should do when suddenly released during a warrant service. Sarah's scream, which had been building in her throat, caught midway. Her body, which had been frozen in that terrible moment of impossible choice, suddenly unfroze in a different way, not the unfreezing of decision, but the unfreezing of absolute shock. What was happening? Who had been standing with his head tilted in childish curiosity, now saw something he could understand, a big dog in a play position, a dog that wanted to play. Every instinct in his 3-year-old body recognized this gesture. Dogs at the park did this. The neighbor's dog did this. This meant friend. "Doggy," squealed with delight. His tiny face broke into an enormous smile. He took a step forward instead of backward. Officer James, running at maximum sprint speed, suddenly became aware that something was profoundly wrong with his understanding of the situation. His commands had stopped working in his throat. His legs were still moving forward, but his brain was struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. Duke wasn't attacking. Duke was play bowing. Duke, the same dog that had once bitten a suspect with such force that the suspect's arm required 30 stitches, was making himself smaller, lowering himself, making himself less threatening to a toddler. No, 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 Officer breathed, half prayer, half desperate hope. His legs were still moving, but his speed was easing slightly as his brain recalibrated. His hands were still reaching forward, but with less urgency. What was happening? Duke's tail, which had been rigid with adrenaline, began to move. Slowly, carefully. Not the full wag of a friendly dog at a park, but a tentative, questioning movement. A tail that seemed to be asking, "Is this okay? Can we really do this?" Reached out his tiny hand. His fingers, still sticky from the juice box he'd been drinking earlier, extended toward Duke's massive head. The dog was probably 3 times weight. The dog's skull was larger than the child's entire torso. The dog's teeth could shred steel if necessary. The dog gently, so incredibly, impossibly gently, extended his nose and touched the child's small palm. And then he made a sound that nobody had expected. A whimper. Not a growl, not a bark, not the aggressive vocalizations that K9 training produced. A soft, almost plaintive whimper, the sound a dog makes when it's lonely, or when it wants comfort, or when it recognizes something in another living being that speaks to its own deeper nature. Mrs., the 73-year-old widow, stopped watering her garden. Her phone was still clutched in her hand, ready to call 911, but the emergency seemed to be resolving itself in a way that made no sense. She lowered the garden hose, water dripping onto her shoes. Martinez, still recording on his phone, whispered, "What the?" His colleagues on his video call had seen the notification that he'd hung up. They didn't know that his full attention was now focused on his backyard, where something impossible was unfolding. Sarah's hand was still covering her mouth, but her eyes were wide with confusion and dawning wonder. The terror that had flooded her system was still present. She could feel it in her trembling legs and her racing heartbeat, but it was beginning to be replaced by something else. Confusion, disbelief, a tentative, terrified hope that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. Officer finally slowed his run to a walk. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving, his face a mask of complete bewilderment. In all his years of police work, in all his training with Duke, nothing had prepared him for this moment. His dog was gentle. His dog was tender. His dog was lying down. Duke lowered himself further, his entire massive body now stretched out on the grass, his head at approximately the same level as head. The dog was making himself deliberately, consciously small. The dog was making a choice, and in that choice was something that seemed almost impossible given everything that Duke had been trained to be. Giggled. It was the sound that broke the spell, that simple, pure, innocent sound of childish delight. The giggle of a 3-year-old who had just discovered a new friend. The giggle that seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood, seeming to say, "Everything is fine." "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. She had moved to the sliding glass door without fully realizing she was moving. Her hand was pressed against the glass. Tears were forming in her eyes, but they were no longer tears of terror. They were tears of something else, relief, wonder, awe at witnessing something that every expectation was now petting Duke's massive head with both tiny hands. The dog was lying completely still, allowing this small human to touch him, accepting the contact with what appeared to be infinite gentleness. The 95-pound police dog and the 35-pound toddler were forming a connection that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of species, training, and circumstance. Officer stood approximately 15 feet away, tears streaming down his face, completely unable to explain what he was witnessing. His lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. His training had not prepared him for this. His experience had not prepared him for this. Nothing could have prepared him for this. The neighborhood had gone silent. All the fear, all the urgency, all the adrenaline-fueled panic had transformed into something else entirely. Witnesses who had been reaching for their phones, who had been bracing for tragedy, were now frozen in astonishment. Leaned against Duke's warm body, treating the massive police dog like a beloved stuffed animal, like a best friend, like something precious and beautiful and wonderful. And Duke allowed it. The dog that had been trained to bite, the dog that had been taught to apprehend suspects, the dog that had been locked into work mode by a warrant service minutes earlier, was now making a choice that violated every principle of his training. Duke was being gentle. Duke was being kind. Duke was being exactly what needed him to be. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly that she nearly dropped her iPhone when she pulled it from her pocket. Her entire body was still flooded with adrenaline, still reverberating with the emotional whiplash of the previous 90 seconds. Terror to confusion to wonder. It was too much for her nervous system to process all at once. Her fingers fumbled with the device, nearly losing it as she tried to activate the camera app. But something inside her, some deeper instinct that transcended the panic, told her that what was happening in her backyard needed to be documented. This moment, this impossible, miraculous, inexplicable moment, it needed to be captured, it needed to be recorded, it needed to be preserved, even though she had no idea why that felt so urgently important. The phone's screen flickered to life in her hand. The camera app loaded. Her hands were trembling, but she managed to position the phone, angling it toward the scene unfolding in her backyard. She hit the record button. What she captured in those 30 seconds would, within hours, be viewed by millions of people around the world. What she was recording, without knowing its eventual impact, without understanding that she was documenting something that would change people's perspectives on compassion, on fear, on the unexpected capacity for gentleness in unlikely places, was pure magic. Was laughing with the kind of uninhibited joy that only young children can produce. It was the sound of absolute delight, of complete safety, of a child who had no concept that moments earlier he had been in potential danger. His small hands were patting Duke's massive head with rhythmic, joyful movements. Every few seconds, he would pause, tilt his head, and examine his new friend with the wonder of discovery. "Doggy, nice doggy," kept saying over and over, his voice filling the audio track of the recording with pure, crystalline happiness. Duke's ears were perked forward, his dark eyes tracking movements with intense focus, but it was a focus born of gentleness rather than aggression. The dog's massive frame remained stretched out on the grass, completely relaxed, completely surrendered to the moment. Every now and then, his tail would wag, slow, deliberate movements that suggested he was aware of what was happening, that he was choosing this, that he was making a conscious decision to be kind. Officer had stopped running entirely. He was now standing approximately 10 feet away from the dog and the child, and his face was a mixture of emotions that would have been impossible to photograph accurately: wonder, confusion, tears, disbelief, professional bewilderment, and something that looked almost like reverence. He was watching his dog, the dog that he had trained, the dog that was supposed to be a tool of law enforcement, behaving in a way that contradicted every principle of police dog training. "I don't understand," Officer whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. His hands, which had been clenched in readiness moments before, now hung loosely at his sides. "Duke, what are you doing?" The dog didn't respond with words, of course, but his behavior seemed to be saying something that Officer's rational mind couldn't quite process. Something about choice, something about recognizing innocence, something about a capacity for compassion that existed somewhere beneath the layers of training, somewhere in the primal consciousness of a being who could choose between aggression and gentleness. Sarah's phone camera was capturing everything. The audio track picked up delighted laughter, the gentle rustling of grass, the occasional soft whimper from Duke, officer's stunned voice. The video quality was clear and steady despite her trembling hands. She had unconsciously braced the phone against her chest, using her body's core strength to keep the angle stable. In the video, visible in the background, Mrs. could be seen standing at her fence, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Martinez, recording on his own phone from his backyard, appeared briefly in the frame as he moved closer to his fence line, trying to get a better view. Other neighbors, people who had heard the commotion, were beginning to emerge from their homes, drawn by the sounds of drama transforming into something transcendent. But none of that mattered to Duke. The child and the dog were existing in their own universe, a space where training didn't matter, where species differences didn't matter, where the only thing that existed was the connection between two beings who, in their own ways, recognized something in each other. Suddenly sat down right next to Duke, his little dinosaur shirt brushing against the dog's fur. Duke immediately shifted his position slightly, accommodating the child, making more room, adjusting his massive body so that would be more comfortable. It was the kind of adjustment that suggested deep emotional intelligence, the kind of awareness that a being has when it truly understands and cares about the comfort of another. "Good boy," said, patting Duke's fur with both hands. "Good doggy, nice doggy." In those moments, words were almost irrelevant. What mattered was the communication happening on a deeper level, the level where a child who had just confronted a massive animal without fear was communicating safety to that animal, and the animal was responding by choosing gentleness, choosing protection, choosing to be exactly what this small human needed. Sarah's hands had stopped shaking. Her phone remained steady. She was no longer thinking about the terror of moments before. She was just recording, just documenting, just witnessing. Officer had moved closer now, approaching slowly, carefully, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He knelt down approximately 5 feet away from Duke, and his face broke into something that looked almost like a smile mixed with tears, a smile of profound relief, a smile of something deeper that he couldn't quite name. "You incredible dog," he said softly, his voice cracking with emotion. "What are you doing? How are you doing this?" Duke's ear flicked toward Officer's voice, acknowledging his handler's presence, but the dog's attention remained focused on. The dog's priority was clear. The child mattered more than anything else in this moment. The child was what needed protecting. The child was what needed to be shown gentleness. 30 seconds. That's all it took. 30 seconds of laughing, of Duke being gentle, of the neighborhood witnessing something that couldn't be explained by training or logic or any rational framework they possessed. 30 seconds that would eventually be shared 40 million times across multiple platforms. 30 seconds that would spark conversations about compassion, fear, and the unexpected capacity for kindness in the most unlikely circumstances. Sarah's finger hovered over the stop button, but she didn't press it yet. She let the recording continue for a few more seconds, capturing the moment where Officer moved closer, where he reached out his hand to touch his dog's back, where his face revealed the depths of his emotion. Finally, at 37 seconds, she stopped the recording. She looked at the video on her phone screen, this small documentation of something extraordinary. She had no idea what she had just captured. She had no idea that this video would eventually change her life, change her family's life, change her community's understanding of what was possible. She only knew that what she had just witnessed needed to be shared. She needed the world to see this. Sarah sat at her kitchen table at 7:43 p.m. on that Saturday evening, her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea that had already gone cold. Was asleep upstairs, exhausted from his extraordinary afternoon. Officer had stayed for another hour, sitting in their living room, still processing what had happened with Duke. They had exchanged contact information. Officer had apologized profusely for the incident. though Sarah had assured him repeatedly that everything was fine, better than fine, actually. After Officer left, after she'd put to bed, after the adrenaline had finally drained from her system and been replaced by an emotional exhaustion she could barely articulate, Sarah had reviewed the video one more time. She was sitting alone in the quiet kitchen. The house settled into the peaceful silence of evening, and she decided that this story needed to be shared. She opened her iPhone and navigated to Facebook. She uploaded the video, all 37 seconds of it, to her personal account. She typed a caption carefully, wanting to convey the magnitude of what had happened without sounding melodramatic or exaggerated. Never underestimate the power of innocence. Our son taught a police dog and his officer what compassion really means. Duke, we will never forget you. She hit post at 7:52 p.m. For approximately 4 minutes, nothing happened. The video sat on her feed with 0 views, 0 comments, 0 shares. Sarah took a sip of her cold tea and grimaced at the temperature. She was about to close the app when her phone buzzed. Her sister had liked the post. Then her mother commented, "Oh my God, this is beautiful." By 8:15 p.m., the video had been viewed 847 times. Most of the views came from her immediate friend circle, people who knew Sarah personally, people who were connected to her through their existing social networks. Comments began appearing. "This is incredible, and that's the sweetest thing I've ever seen. And wow, what a moment." By 8:47 p.m., the view count had jumped to 5,389. The video was being shared to people outside of Sarah's immediate circle. People were sharing it with their friends, their family, their followers. One of Sarah's acquaintances, a woman named Jennifer who worked in marketing, shared it to a popular Facebook community dedicated to heartwarming stories from around the world. That community had 2.3 million members. At 9:23 p.m., the view count hit 127,000. Sarah received a text message from a number she didn't recognize. It was from a local news station requesting permission to use her video for a story. She almost didn't respond, but then curiosity overcame caution. She texted back that they could use it. By 10:15 p.m., the video had 2.3 million views. People around the world were experiencing what Sarah had experienced in her backyard: the shock, the wonder, the inexplicable gentleness of Duke, the pure joy of. But they were experiencing it through a screen, through the mediation of pixels and internet connection, and something about that distance made it feel universal. It made it feel like everyone's story. It made it feel like a moment that belonged to all of humanity. Comments were pouring in from every corner of the globe. "This made me cry. This is what the world needs right now. The police officer is crying, I'm crying, everyone's crying. That dog knew the child was innocent. How did he know? This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Finally, something that restores my faith in humanity. This is what unconditional love looks like." In Japan, a woman named was watching the video at 1:47 a.m. on Sunday morning. She worked as a translator and had been scrolling through social media during her insomnia. She watched Laugh and pet Duke's head, and something inside her broke open. She hadn't cried in months, since her husband had passed away 2 years earlier. But watching this video, seeing the unexpected gentleness, seeing the impossible compassion, tears began flowing down her face. She shared the video with her comment, "The world is still beautiful." In Australia, a police officer named, coincidentally sharing the child's name, watched the video during his lunch break. He worked with police dogs himself. He had been cynical about his job, worn down by the constant negativity, the endless parade of human cruelty he witnessed. Watching Duke's gentleness, watching a K-9 officer's face transform with wonder and emotion, something inside him shifted. He called his wife and told her, "I think I remember why I do this job." By midnight, the video had 11.4 million views. News outlets were scrambling to cover the story. Local Portland news had been first, picking it up within an hour of the video going viral. But by midnight, national news organizations were getting involved. CNN requested an interview. NBC wanted to film at the family's home. Fox News was pitching a segment. News organizations didn't need to verify the story. The video was irrefutable evidence that something extraordinary had happened. They just needed the details, the backstory, the narrative framework to present this moment to even larger audiences. David, Sarah's husband, arrived home around 9 p.m. to find his wife sitting at the kitchen table, her phone buzzing with dozens of notifications per minute. He watched the video, and his face went through the same emotional journey that Sarah's had gone through: confusion, wonder, tears, disbelief. "Is this real?" he asked, watching his son laugh with Duke. "It's completely real," Sarah said, "and apparently the entire world wants to talk about it." By 2 a.m., the video had 47.3 million views. It was being shared on Instagram, on TikTok, on Twitter, on WhatsApp, on messaging apps in countries whose names Sarah couldn't pronounce. It was being translated into dozens of languages. People were adding their own commentary, their own reactions, their own stories of unexpected compassion. A woman in Brazil wrote, "This is what we need instead of news about violence and fear." A man in Germany commented, "Animals have wisdom we've forgotten. This dog understands something we don't." A teenager in South Korea added, "I'm showing this to everyone I know. This is the most important video on the internet." In newsrooms around the world, editors were making decisions. This story was leading the morning broadcasts. This story was too human, too beautiful, too impactful to ignore. News organizations that competed fiercely with each other were all running the same story, the story of a boy, a dog, and an impossible moment of connection that seemed to say something profound about kindness, about fear, about what happens when we choose gentleness over aggression. By sunrise on Sunday morning, the video had 67 million views. Sarah had barely slept. She was sitting on her couch, refreshing her social media feeds, watching in real time as her private backyard moment became a global phenomenon. Her phone had received over 3,000 messages. News outlets wanted interviews. People wanted to know more. The internet wanted more information, more context, more connection to this beautiful thing that had happened. Officer texted her around 7 a.m. "Have you seen how big this has gotten? Duke is famous, we're all famous." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was still processing what was happening. She had simply wanted to share a beautiful moment. She had no idea that this beautiful moment would become a message of hope to millions of people who were desperate for hope, who were tired of negativity, who were hungry for evidence that the world still contained kindness. By Monday morning, the story had been covered by every major news organization on the planet. "Boy and police dog share unexpected moment of connection" was the headline echoing across media platforms worldwide. What had started as a 37-second video in a Portland backyard had become something larger than any of them could have imagined. It had become a moment that belonged to the world. Captain Michael Torres sat in his office at the Portland Police Department headquarters at 6:47 a.m. on Monday morning, the video playing on his computer screen for approximately the 40th time. Behind him, through his office window, he could see the Portland skyline beginning to brighten with the approaching dawn. On his desk were 17 printed pages of interview notes, messages from the chief of police, and a preliminary incident report filed by Officer James regarding the circumstances surrounding the K-9 separation from handler and subsequent interaction with civilian child. Captain Torres was a 17-year veteran of the police department. He had seen K-9 incidents before. Most of them were straightforward, dogs doing what they were trained to do, apprehending suspects, performing narcotics detection, occasionally biting people who posed threats. Those incidents required incident reports, sometimes investigations, occasionally use-of-force justifications. But this was different. This wasn't a use-of-force incident. This was the opposite of force. This was gentleness in a situation that should have produced aggression. This was a violation of everything police dog training was designed to produce, and simultaneously, it was the most beautiful outcome possible. At 7:15 a.m., Captain Torres picked up his phone and made a call to Dr. Sarah, a board-certified veterinary behaviorist who consulted with the Portland Police Department on K-9 matters. "Doctor, I know it's early, but I need your professional expertise on something," Torres said when she answered. "Have you seen the video that went viral, the one with our K-9? There was a pause, then Doctor laughed, a short, almost disbelieving laugh. "Captain, I've been watching it all night. I couldn't sleep. I've been analyzing it frame by frame. This is one of the most unusual behavioral displays I've ever witnessed in a working dog." By 10 a.m., Captain Torres had convened a special meeting in the police department's conference room. Present were Officer Dr. Sarah, doctor no relation to the family in the video, a psychologist specializing in animal behavior, and Chief of Police Robert. "What we're looking at," Doctor began, standing in front of a screen displaying freeze frames from the video, "is a deliberate behavioral choice on Duke's part. Notice this frame right here." She pointed to the moment where Duke's posture shifted from charging to play bow. "This isn't an accident. This isn't a failure of training. This is Duke making a conscious decision to change his behavior. His muscles are engaged differently. His ear position is different. His tail position is different. All of these are choices." Doctor, the psychologist, leaned forward. "What's remarkable is what happened in his brain at that moment. Most dogs, especially trained police dogs, operate on a hierarchy of responses. When they're in work mode, when they've been activated by a warrant service and are flooded with adrenaline, they default to their primary training. But Duke appears to have that." "His training?" Chief asked, his tone suggesting concern. "Is that a failure of training?" "No, sir," Doctor said firmly. "It's not a failure. It's something more complex. It's evidence of an intelligence that goes beyond training. Duke appears to have assessed the situation, recognized that the child posed no threat, and made a decision to respond with gentleness instead of aggression. That requires a level of cognitive processing that honestly exceeds what we typically see in police dogs." Officer was sitting quietly, listening, his face revealing nothing, but his hands were gripping the edge of the table tightly. "There's something else," Doctor continued. "I reviewed Duke's background file. I called the breeding facility where he came from. I spoke to his original trainers. Duke was rescued from an abusive situation when he was 2 years old before police training began. His original owner had trained him through harsh methods, through fear and pain. But despite that trauma, despite starting his police training with those psychological wounds, Duke has consistently been one of our most successful K-9 officers." She paused, letting that sink in. "What I think happened in that backyard is that Duke recognized something in that he understood deeply: vulnerability, innocence, a being that couldn't defend itself. And rather than defaulting to his police training, rather than defaulting to dominance or aggression, he defaulted to something deeper. He defaulted to compassion. He defaulted to what his own trauma had taught him about recognizing fear and suffering in others." Chief was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "What are you recommending, Doctor?" "I'm recommending that this incident not be treated as a failure or a disciplinary matter. I'm recommending that Officer and Duke be commended. I'm recommending that we study what happened here to understand canine psychology better. And I'm recommending that we develop what I would call the Duke Protocol training methods that acknowledge that police dogs are sentient beings capable of ethical decision-making, not just tools of aggression." Captain Torres turned to Officer. "Officer, you've been quiet. What are your thoughts?" Officer's voice was rough when he spoke. "With respect, sir, I don't think Duke failed his training. I think Duke transcended his training. I think Duke proved that he's not just a weapon. He's a partner. He's a thinking being with choices. And in that moment with that child, he chose kindness. I've never been more proud of him. By noon, Captain Torres had made his decision. He called a press conference. Standing before television cameras and reporters, with Officer and Duke beside him, Captain Torres made an announcement that would ripple through police departments across the country. Officer James is being commended for his professionalism during the incident that occurred on Saturday. K9 Duke has demonstrated exceptional behavioral control and moral reasoning. Rather than disciplining Officer for losing control of his dog, we are elevating him to a new position, K9 Behavioral Specialist. Duke's behavior in that backyard has taught us something profound about the nature of the beings we work with, and we intend to learn from that lesson. The room erupted with questions. Journalists wanted to know more. They wanted statements. They wanted analysis. Captain Torres had only one statement. This dog understood something that many of us struggle with. That innocence deserves protection, not punishment. That's a lesson worth learning. Within 24 hours, 12 other police departments had requested consultation with Dr. about implementing Duke Protocol training methods. Universities interested in animal psychology began requesting access to the video for case studies. The American Kennel Club requested permission to feature Duke's story in their official magazine. Officer, who had been devastated by the incident, who had blamed himself for losing control of his dog, was now being hailed as a handler who had trained a dog with extraordinary emotional intelligence. The narrative had shifted. What had been a potential disaster was now being framed as an evolutionary moment in how police departments understood and worked with canine partners. Duke, meanwhile, was being showered with requests for appearances, interviews, and public events, but Captain Torres made a decision to limit Duke's public exposure. Duke needs to be a working dog, he announced, but his work is going to change. We're pairing him with and his family for a community policing initiative. We're also making Duke available for therapy visits to trauma survivors, particularly children who have experienced abuse or fear. If this dog can teach other beings about compassion, then that's his true calling. By the end of the week, the investigation was officially closed. Its conclusion: K9 Duke demonstrated exemplary behavioral control and decision-making in recognizing and responding appropriately to a vulnerable civilian. This incident represents not a failure of training, but an extraordinary example of animal intelligence transcending rigid programming. Recommendation: use this case as model for future K9 training protocols. What had started as a terrifying moment in a suburban backyard had become, through professional analysis and institutional recognition, a turning point in how law enforcement understood the animals they worked with, not as tools, but as thinking, feeling beings capable of choosing compassion. Waited by the front window every Friday afternoon at 3:47 p.m., exactly 13 minutes before Officer James and Duke were scheduled to arrive for their weekly visit. He had learned the arrival time perfectly during the first 3 months of their friendship. At age 3 turning 4, had developed the kind of anticipatory awareness that only comes when something matters profoundly to you. "Is Duke here yet?" he would ask his mother repeatedly, his nose pressed against the glass, his eyes scanning the quiet suburban street with the intensity of someone waiting for the most important person in his life. Every single Friday, without fail, Officer's police vehicle would turn the corner onto their street at exactly 4 p.m., would squeal with delight, abandoning the window and running to the front door. Sarah would open it and would explode onto the porch like a rocket that had been compressed all week just waiting for release. "Duke, Duke, Duke," he would chant, running toward the massive German Shepherd with absolutely no fear, with complete trust, with the kind of love that only exists between beings who have crossed some invisible threshold together. Officer would step out of the car, smiling, a smile that had become more genuine with each passing week, a smile that had transformed him from a man racked with guilt into a man who understood that sometimes the best moments in life arrive unexpectedly, that sometimes the most important relationships are the ones that violate every expectation. 6 months into their friendship, had learned Duke's favorite spots. He knew that Duke loved to have his ears rubbed in a specific way, soft, circular motions that made the dog's eyes close in what appeared to be bliss. He knew that Duke's favorite place to nap was on the back porch in the afternoon sun. He knew that Duke made a specific whimper sound when he was happy, distinct from his other vocalizations. Had developed an intuitive understanding of another being's emotional landscape that most adults never achieved. Officer watched this friendship deepen week after week, and something inside him was healing. He had carried guilt about the incident for months, guilt about losing control of his dog, guilt about putting a child in danger, guilt about all the ways that moment could have ended differently. But watching and Duke together, watching his dog transform into a gentle guardian, watching this small boy learn to love with absolute purity, Officer began to understand that sometimes what feels like failure is actually redirection. Sometimes what seems like a mistake is actually an invitation toward something deeper. One Friday evening, after had fallen asleep and Duke was resting on the back porch, Officer sat with Sarah on the front steps. "He's changing because of you," Sarah said, her voice soft in the evening air. "Is changing. He's more confident, he's braver, he's kinder. He talks about Duke all the time. He tells other children about his friend the police dog. He's not the same boy he was 6 months ago." Officer was quiet for a long moment. "Duke is changing too," he finally said. "After the warrant service, I thought I had broken him. I thought I had damaged him psychologically. But this boy, this innocent boy, he's healing something in Duke that I didn't even know needed healing. And Duke's healing something in me." By month 9, schools began requesting Officer and Duke for assembly programs. The police department, having seen the positive community response, had officially designated the pairing as a community relations initiative. Officer would bring Duke to elementary schools, and he would tell the story, the real story, not sanitized but the actual narrative of what had happened that day. He would show the video to auditoriums full of children, and he would watch their faces process the miracle they were witnessing. He would explain how Duke had made a choice, how innocence had communicated something to Duke that transcended training, how sometimes the most powerful moments in life are the ones that break our expectations. "This dog," Officer would say, his voice emotional every single time, "understands something that all of us need to understand. When we encounter something innocent, something vulnerable, something that can't hurt us, we have a choice. We can respond with aggression because that's what we've been trained to do, or we can respond with compassion because that's what we choose to do. Duke chose compassion." The children in those assemblies would leave transformed. Teachers reported that children who had been afraid of police began asking their parents about police dogs. Children who had been anxious about animals began asking about training and behavior. The incident that had started in a backyard had rippled out through entire school systems, changing how children understood authority, animals, and the possibility of unexpected kindness. By year 1, had begun visiting the police station with Officer every other week. He would walk through the halls wearing a tiny junior officer badge that Officer's captain had created specifically for him. Officers would stop and ask questions, would explain about Duke, about the day they met, about how important it was to be kind to animals. Started asking questions about the animals at the station. He wanted to know everything about K-9 training. He watched training videos obsessively. He read children's books about police dogs. His bedroom was decorated with police dog posters and photographs of himself with Duke. His mother found him at age 5, drawing pictures of himself as an adult, helping dogs like Duke. Officer became more than just a visitor. He became a mentor, an uncle figure, someone watched and learned from and emulated. Officer began taking on educational rides where they would drive around Portland. An officer would explain what police work was really like, not the Hollywood version, but the actual work of serving a community, of making a difference, of choosing to protect even when it was difficult. By year 2, Duke was showing his age. The dog was 7 years old in human terms, which meant he was in his mid-50s. His black fur was beginning to show around his muzzle. His movements were slightly slower. Officer and the police department made a decision. Duke would retire from police work and transition to what they called therapeutic partnership work. Duke moved in with the family part-time. Officer maintained his primary home with the dog, but Duke spent every weekend with. The arrangement allowed Duke to continue his important work, healing children who had experienced trauma, while also allowing him the kind of rest and comfort that he had earned through his lifetime of service. Now 5 years old became Duke's primary caretaker during those weekend visits. He learned responsibility. He learned compassion. He learned that love required care and attention and presence. He learned that beings who had been through trauma, like Duke, who had been abused before becoming a police dog, needed extra gentleness and understanding. Sarah watched her son transform from a boy who had almost been hit by a charging dog into a young child who understood, on a deep level, what it meant to care for another being. She watched Officer transform from a guilt-ridden handler into a mentor and community educator. She watched Duke transform from a working police dog into something more, a healer, a teacher, a bridge between humans and animals. One evening, as was falling asleep with his head resting against Duke's warm body, he whispered something that Sarah heard from the doorway. "Duke, you saved me that day, and I'm going to spend my whole life helping dogs like you. I promise." Officer, standing in the hallway beside Sarah, had tears streaming down his face. What had started as a terrifying moment in a backyard had become the foundation for a profound human life devoted to service and compassion. 20 years later, on a cold November morning in Portland, Oregon, stood outside the home he had grown up in, the house with the backyard where everything had changed. He was now 23 years old, a third-year veterinary student at Oregon State University. He was wearing a jacket embroidered with the logo of the Duke's Heart Foundation, an organization that he and Officer had established 15 years earlier to fund community policing initiatives and animal rehabilitation programs. The backyard looked exactly the same and completely different simultaneously. The same oak trees provided shade. The same fence line marked the property boundaries. The same grass grew where and Duke had first met. But the space now carried historical significance. A small bronze plaque, unveiled 3 years earlier during a community ceremony, read, "In this backyard, on September 15, 2005, a 3-year-old boy and a police dog taught a community that compassion transcends training." This moment reminds us that the most powerful connections often arrive unexpectedly. The original video, the one Sarah had filmed on her iPhone while trembling with a mixture of terror and wonder, had now been viewed over 172 million times across multiple platforms. It continued to be shared, particularly in October and November when social media users engaged in positivity challenges. Universities had created case studies around it. Psychology departments used it to teach about animal cognition. Police academies screened it as part of their training programs. It had become embedded in the cultural consciousness in a way that few moments ever did. Officer James was now 58 years old and officially retired from the Portland Police Department, but his retirement was far from quiet. His memoir, When the Dog Teaches the Man, Duke and the Power of Unexpected Compassion, had become a bestseller. It had been translated into 19 languages. He had spent the last decade traveling to 47 different states and 6 different countries, giving motivational speeches about the incident, about animal psychology, about the importance of recognizing the sentience and emotional depth of the beings we shared our lives with. The book had resonated with readers in ways that transcended the typical memoir audience. Therapists recommended it to clients. Social workers used it in training programs. Prison reform advocates cited it as evidence of the potential for rehabilitation and change. Veterans dealing with PTSD found something in the story about wounded beings finding healing through unexpected connection. Children read it and began asking questions about animals, about choice, about what it meant to be kind. Officer had also been instrumental in developing what had become known nationwide as the Duke Protocol, a new training methodology for police dogs that acknowledged them as sentient beings capable of ethical decision-making, not just tools of law enforcement. The protocol had been adopted by 287 police departments across the United States and increasingly by law enforcement agencies internationally. It emphasized recognizing situations where compassion might be more appropriate than force, training dogs to read context and respond accordingly, and treating canine officers not as weapons but as partners with their own moral agency. Universities across the country had established Duke study programs, interdisciplinary initiatives that combined animal psychology, behavioral science, law enforcement training, and philosophy to examine what had happened that day and what it meant about the nature of consciousness, choice, and compassion in non-human animals. University of Oregon had created a specific fellowship program in Duke's name, funding graduate students researching animal behavior and human-animal bonding. The family's backyard had become a minor historical landmark. Local tourism guides included it in their walks. News organizations revisited the story annually. On the anniversary of the original incident, September 15th had become informally known in Portland as Duke Day, with local schools celebrating by discussing kindness, teaching children about police dogs, and showing the original video to new generations of students. Strangers approached constantly and they all said similar things. A woman in her 60s had told him, "I was going through a dark time when that video went viral. I was depressed. I was considering. Well, I wasn't in a good place. Your story reminded me that the world still had goodness in it. It saved my life." A police officer from Arizona had tracked him down through social media to say, "I was jaded, burned out, ready to leave the force. I watched your video with Duke, and I remembered why I became a police officer in the first place. I'm still on the force because of what Duke taught me about compassion." A man from Japan had written, "Your story helped me understand my own dog differently. I was harsh with him because I was harsh with myself. Watching Duke choose gentleness, I learned how to choose gentleness too. My life is different now." Had received over 47,000 messages from people around the world telling him that the video had changed their perspective on fear, on animals, on the capacity for unexpected kindness in ordinary moments. Each message had moved him, had reinforced his commitment to his life's work. Duke had passed away at age 16, an extraordinarily long life for a German Shepherd. His final years had been spent split between Officer's home and the family's house, surrounded by the people he loved, receiving the kind of gentle care that a lifetime of service had earned. His death had been covered by news outlets internationally. Thousands of people had attended a memorial service in Portland. His ashes had been scattered in the backyard where he had first met. But Duke's legacy lived on in so many ways. The foundation that bore his name had funded over 3,400 dog rescue and rehabilitation operations. It had provided financial support to 57 K-9 officers dealing with PTSD. It had sponsored animal therapy programs in hospitals, prisons, and schools. The money that had poured in after the video went viral had been transformed into concrete, lasting impact. Preparing for his career as a veterinary behaviorist, had modeled his professional goals directly on understanding animals the way Duke understood, not as simple creatures operating on instinct alone, but as beings with their own consciousness, their own choices, their own capacity for moral decision-making. He had chosen veterinary school specifically to work in animal psychology and rehabilitation, particularly with animals that had experienced trauma. He wanted to understand, in scientific terms, what had happened in Duke's mind that day. He wanted to help other animals make the same kinds of choices that Duke had made. Every November 3rd, the anniversary of the day the video went viral, received a call from Officer. They would talk about what the moment had meant, how their lives had been forever altered by those 37 seconds, how grateful they were for the accident of fate that had brought them together that day. "We didn't change the world," Officer had said during their last call, "but we showed the world something about itself that it had forgotten. We showed that compassion is always a choice, and when someone or something makes that choice, it matters. It changes everything." Standing in the backyard on this November morning, looked at the spot where Duke had performed his play Bo, where innocence had disarmed aggression, where a moment of connection had become a message of hope transmitted to millions. He thought about all the lives that had been touched, all the perspectives that had shifted, all the people and animals whose trajectories had been altered because of what had happened on this grass on a sunny afternoon 20 years ago. And he understood that this was his legacy too, not just as the boy in the video, but as someone who had dedicated his life to continuing what Duke had started, to spreading the message that compassion is a choice, and that even the smallest moments, when filmed and shared, can transform the world. The story wasn't over. It had never been over. It continued unfolding in schools and police academies and veterinary clinics, and in the hearts of millions of people who watched that video and learned something essential about kindness, fear, and the unexpected capacity for gentleness in the most unlikely circumstances. This moment, this backyard, would always matter.